So the structural problem that the legislation needs to deal with, simply put, is that if a business on the edge of viability can only afford to pay a worker the $1,500 JobKeeper amount, unless we change the Fair Work Act, we cannot guarantee that a worker can lawfully work the right amount of hours for the $1,500 payment. Now, Labor suggests, I think in the words of Tony Burke, their view is that that should be done by the Commission, the Fair Work Commission. Now, the difficulty with that is that that would require changes to 121 modern awards, an unknown but high percentage of 11,000 enterprise agreements. In addition, there are 4 million Australians that are covered by individual arrangements of a variety of types, some tied to awards, some not tied to awards. That process, if it could be done, would take weeks, if not months, to complete. The only sure way that we can guarantee that a person works the right amount of hours for the $1,500 payment, if that is all that the business can afford because its viability is threatened, is to change the Fair Work Act. It's as simple as that. So that is why we're doing what we are doing, legislation to create the payment but also facilitate the transmission of the money to the worker who needs it to save their job. It's very simple. And to give you an idea about why this is the best, simplest and only guaranteed way to ensure that jobs are saved, last year the Fair Work Commission took an average of 20 days each to approve 5,000 enterprise agreements. So 5,000 enterprise agreements were approved. It took 20 days per agreement, and that took a year. So the idea that you could amend some unknown but high percentage of 11,000 enterprise agreements in the time that we have available in the challenging and emergent situation that 6 million Australian workers face is simply not plausible. If there were an easier way, we would adopt it. This is the only guaranteed way to make the $1,500 payments flow in a lawful way to save Australian jobs. I've described it as $130 billion worth of lifeboats going out. This is Parliament's Dunkirk moment. We get the lifeboats out and we save jobs, and we do it in the simplest, clearest, guaranteed formula that Parliament can devise.
Mr. Can you walk us through what safeguards there will be to take account of the union's concerns, and will there also be a sunset clause on these changes?
The changes will only last for 6 months. So 6 months is how long the payments are there for, and 6 months is how long the changes to the Fair Work Act to facilitate the payments are there for. Of course, for an employer to enter the scheme, they have to be able to show distress, and that distress is a measure 30% of turnover if they have a turnover less than $1 billion, 50% above $1 billion. You would have noted that the Treasurer announced a greater inclusivity of the program with respect to not-for-profits and charities, where the test will be 15% of the turnover. So that's the test. Inside the changes to the Fair Work Act, there will be a secondary requirement about the viability of the business and the necessity to give a direction around hours worked to save the job of the employee in question. And that decision will be reviewable by the Fair Work Commission, so that there will be safeguards in the process of trying to make the hours match the $1,500 payment if the business is in so much distress that that's all it can afford to do and remain viable in the circumstances. I mean, this is about saving jobs. And what we don't want to have is a situation where we're waiting for enterprise agreements to change, and so a worker ends up with no job, no wage, no way to pay a mortgage, because we've not lawfully facilitated the transmission of a $1,500 base wage to that worker. I mean, that would be ridiculous. That is an argument about process. And what appears to be happening now is that people all agree that there have to be changes to allow the $1,500 payments to flow and save jobs, but some people would prefer it be done a more complicated way through the Fair Work Commission. I simply find that extraordinary.
Mr. Porter, yesterday, Mr. Porter, yesterday you indicated that there might be some flexibility when it comes to the definition of casuals. For example, casuals who might have a diarised list of employers over a 12-month period and might have done so, for example, the gig economy is a classic case. If someone has been in employment regularly and continuously, albeit with more than one employer, would they be eligible for the $1,500 payment?
Not under the definition that we're using, which is straight from the Fair Work Act, which talks about systemic and continuous employment for a 12-month period. But I think, Andrew, the point there, and we've tried to be as inclusive as possible, and you'll see that through the changes in the definition for charities and not-for-profits. But even with expenditure of this extraordinary size, there have to be some definitions and some lines drawn. We think this is a fair and reasonable line, but also keep in mind that with the changes to the job seeker payment, which is effectively a doubling of New Start, and the ability of a casual worker to also earn money on top of that payment, that there is going to be an equivalence between a casual worker who would receive JobKeeper, the $1,500 through their employer, and someone who would have to go onto the job seeker payment, but also has the capacity to pick up work as well.